Rachel's footsteps echoed down the empty street, each one laced with silent desperation. The sky hadn't yet turned blue, but her day had already begun with the weight of the world on her shoulders. This wasn't just another job interview. It was a shot at saving her mother's life. That's what people often forget about these moments. Behind every resume is a real story. A daughter, a caretaker, a fighter, all hidden behind polite smiles and nervous hands. The phone trembled in her grip as she called her mom. Her voice tried to sound brave, but it cracked at the edges, betraying the fear crawling beneath her skin. "I'll fix this, Mom. Today's the day." It was the kind of sentence you say more to convince yourself than the other person. Still, there was love in her words, a soft kind that only grows in the soil of suffering. It was the kind of emotional story that begins long before anyone else notices. Behind her, a man stood quietly, sipping his coffee, pretending not to listen. But how could he not? Her words clung to the air like morning fog, impossible to ignore. He didn't know her name, didn't know what she looked like, but something about her tone, the ache, the resolve, felt like a touching story unfolding in real time. Some things you don't just hear, you feel. Rachel ended the call with a deep breath, as if exhaling her entire life's worth of pressure. Her hands shook, not from caffeine, but from carrying too much hope for too long. People often say hope is light, but they forget. When you're the only one holding it, it can feel heavier than despair. She tucked the phone away, brushed her coat, and prepared herself for what felt like a battle. What she didn't know was that someone had already noticed the soldier in her. In a world obsessed with resumes and LinkedIn profiles, no one sees the woman waking up early to fight for someone else's tomorrow. That's Rachel. That's the real story beneath the dress shirt and nervous smile. It's the kind of story job titles don't capture, the kind that lives in the pauses of a phone call, in the silence between two heartbeats. And someone nearby had heard every beat of it. There's a strange power in being overheard, not in a way that feels invasive, but intimate, like your heart accidentally spoke to a stranger's soul. Rachel had no idea someone was listening. She didn't know her story had just brushed against someone else's timeline. And neither of them could predict that one small, unnoticed moment was about to spiral into something far more unexpected. As she turned toward the counter, still lost in thought, the aroma of coffee and the murmur of voices faded into the background. All she wanted was a few seconds of peace before facing a building full of strangers. But fate had other plans. Sometimes the universe answers desperate prayers in the most chaotic, clumsy ways imaginable. Just as Rachel reached for her drink, her world jolted again. Not from fear this time, but from contact. The cup slipped between her fingers and splashed onto the man behind her, a dark stain blooming across his crisp shirt. Her heart sank faster than the liquid hit the floor. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," she stammered, panic flaring her chest. In that instant, everything she feared about this day seemed to be crashing down. Most people would have flinched, maybe even snapped, but not him. The man, tall and composed, simply blinked and gave a quiet laugh, brushing off the mess like it didn't matter. "No harm done," he said, as if coffee on your clothes was a sign of good luck. His tone wasn't annoyed. It was kind, reassuring, the kind that makes your defenses fall, even when your world feels like it's unraveling. Rachel scrambled for napkins, hands trembling, cheeks flushed with shame. She felt like a walking disaster, too broken to function, too stressed to breathe. Yet, even as her fingers trembled, the man's presence remained calm, like an anchor in the storm. And oddly, he wasn't looking at her like she was a problem. He looked at her like she was a person. That rare, kind of emotional story few ever pause long enough to notice. They exchanged a few awkward words, the kind that don't mean much, yet somehow mean everything. She thanked him. He smiled again. For a moment, the world slowed. The cafe noise dulled to a soft hum, and time stood still between them. It wasn't romance. Not yet. But it was connection. Fragile and unspoken, like the first line of a touching story still being written. And just like that, she was gone. Out the door, rushing toward her interview. unaware that her path had just crossed someone who would matter. The man stood still for a second, watching her leave, his thoughts tangled in more than just the accident. People bump into each other all the time. But sometimes, fate hides its biggest gifts inside life's smallest collisions. Moments like these don't come with neon signs or background music. They arrive wrapped in chaos, often looking like mistakes. A spilled coffee, a ruined shirt, a nervous apology. Who would think such a mess could mark the start of a real story? And yet, there it was. A scene so ordinary, it almost slipped away unnoticed. Almost. As he looked down at the coffee stain, something lingered. Not frustration, but curiosity. There was something about her. The way she spoke, the fear in her eyes, the courage behind it. He didn't even know her name, but she had left something behind. Not on his shirt, in his mind. And what neither of them knew was that their next encounter would happen sooner than either expected. The company's glass tower loomed above her like a fortress, sleek and silent, daring her to enter. Rachel stood at its base for a moment, gathering the fragments of herself scattered since the cafe. Her palms were still slightly damp, not from a spill but from mistakes. This wasn't about ambition. It was about survival. And that makes every step heavier, every second louder. Inside, everything gleamed with cold precision. Receptionists with robotic smiles, walls that echoed with formality, and chairs that weren't meant for comfort. No one noticed her nerves, her rushed breath, her silent prayer. She was just another applicant in a tailored jacket. But beneath that fabric, a real story was pulsing, one they couldn't see, but one she carried like armor. She checked in, sat down, and folded her hands to stop them from shaking. People talk a lot about preparation for interviews, mock questions, perfect answers. But nothing prepares you for sitting in a lobby, knowing your mother's health depends on what happens next. That kind of pressure doesn't teach you eloquence. It teaches you how to endure when everything feels like it's crumbling. Her name was called, and she rose like someone walking toward judgment. The hallway stretched longer than it should, her heels clicking against the tile like a countdown. She passed glass offices with polished people and tight smiles, none of them aware they were walking past a woman who hadn't slept properly in weeks. This wasn't just her shot. It was her mother's breath, her future's balance. She couldn't afford to fail. The interview room was all glass and chrome, nothing to soften the edges. 3 people sat at the table, eyes unreadable, expressions stiff. Rachel sat down, spine straight, mask in place. But inside it was chaos. Her brain screamed doubts, her stomach tied knots, but her voice, when it came, was calm. Because when you've survived worse, a table full of strangers is just another mountain. It's strange how spaces can feel alive. That room didn't welcome her, it studied her. And still, she pushed forward. She had done harder things. Cleaned hospital bathrooms on double shifts, studied for exams by flashlight, skipped dinners so her mom could eat. No glass wall could intimidate someone who'd already walked through fire. And yet, something told her this wasn't the hardest part of her day. As she spoke her name and waited for the first question, she glanced across the table. That's when something shifted. Her breath caught, not because of fear, but familiarity. A face she recognized, not from a resume or LinkedIn post, but from earlier that morning, standing in line for coffee. And in that heartbeat, the job interview she feared became something else entirely. Rachel's heart skipped as her eyes locked onto him. The man from the cafe, now in a suit sharp enough to cut through glass. There was no trace of the coffee spill, no indication of the chaos they'd shared hours earlier. Just Mr. Donovan, composed and unreadable, seated like a king in his boardroom. For a split second, she questioned her memory. Could it really be him? But deep down, something confirmed what her eyes refused to deny. He gave no sign of recognition, no flicker, no smirk. His gaze was steady, professional. But inside, something stirred. He remembered her. Not just the nervous woman in the cafe, but the voice on the phone, the trembling hands, the courage behind them. It was like watching a touching story unfold live, with new layers he hadn't expected. She sat across from him, trying to focus. not knowing that her life had already impacted his. She didn't know that her emotional story had echoed in his chest since sunrise. Her mind raced through potential questions, trying to block out the surreal weight of his presence. He wasn't just a stranger anymore, and yet she had to act like he was. Because now, the stakes were even higher. Mr. Donovan leaned back slightly, studying her not as a resume, but as a person. The panel didn't know. To them, she was just one more hopeful face in a long line of applicants. But to him, she was already unforgettable. The real story behind her eyes painted a picture more vivid than any bullet point could. And somehow, he knew this wasn't just about a position. This was about a purpose. Rachel didn't flinch. She spoke as if nothing had happened, not even a spill. But her voice carried layers, struggle, strength, and something rare, sincerity. Donovan listened, not like a boss, like a witness to something quietly remarkable. His colleagues asked routine questions, jotting notes, but he was hearing something else entirely, something that made the interview room feel almost sacred. There's a moment, rarely spoken of, when someone realizes they're watching a chapter begin. That's what was happening. Donovan saw it, the way she sat tall despite the weight on her shoulders, the way her presence demanded no pity, only respect. She hadn't just shown up for a job. She had walked in carrying an invisible legacy, the kind that stays with you long after the door closes. And as the questions kept coming, he kept wondering, how much had life demanded of her? How long had she been this strong, this silent, this determined? He wasn't supposed to care, but now he did. And although he didn't say a word about the cafe or the phone call, that morning was still echoing between them. Rachel didn't come armed with buzzwords or rehearsed brilliance. She came with truth, unpolished, unfiltered, and quietly powerful. She spoke about late-night bus rides, jobs that paid too little, and the books she read under flickering bulbs. Her words weren't designed to impress. They were simply real. And somehow, that honesty filled the room more than any perfect answer ever could. Donovan didn't write anything down. He didn't have to. He was seeing what few ever get to witness, the person behind the paper. Her voice, though steady, carried the weariness of someone who had been strong for too long. And that's what struck him most. This wasn't just a candidate. This was a living, breathing, emotional story, one built on sacrifice and unwavering love. She never mentioned the cafe, never said a word about her mother or the coffee spill. But the strength behind her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't there to play a sympathy card. She was there to earn her place. And in that quiet refusal to beg for empathy, she proved more than a resume ever could. The panel kept asking, unaware that the Real interview had already happened hours earlier. When a daughter whispered promises through a phone call. When a stranger listened and never forgot. Donovan saw her now with new eyes, not just as an applicant, but as a force of nature. Someone who'd endured quietly and still stood tall. A touching story unfolding in real time. Rachel talked about resilience, but never used the word. She just told stories of saving coins, skipping meals, holding 2 jobs without letting school slip. It wasn't dramatized. It was her life, told in calm tones and humble posture. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. Because you don't need to raise your voice when the truth already speaks so loud. Donovan leaned forward once, not to interrogate, but to connect. He asked one question, not about skills, about how she kept going. And her answer, though simple, made the room pause. Because I didn't have a choice. There was no drama, no pause for effect. Just a sentence that landed with quiet thunder. A real story compressed into a handful of words. And as the interview moved on, Donovan already knew. The others might still be judging qualifications. He was seeing a legacy, something raw and rare. And though he said nothing then, something inside him had already made a choice. Not out of pity, out of respect. And maybe, just maybe, out of something else too. The call came sooner than she expected. Rachel had braced herself for rejection, for the silence that so often follows hope. But instead, her phone rang, and with it, the words that would change everything. We'd like to offer you the position and a mentorship. Her knees nearly gave out. She'd made it, not just to a job, but to something bigger than she had dared to imagine. Donovan didn't explain his decision to the board. Some things don't need defending. What he saw in Rachel went beyond qualifications. It was the kind of strength you can't teach, the kind you only earn by living through storms. He knew there would be questions, but none of them mattered, because deep down, he wasn't just investing in an employee. He was backing a real story that deserved to be told. When Rachel walked through the doors again, something was different. Not the building, not the faces, but the way he looked at her, not just with welcome, but recognition. The cafe memory now hovered between them, like a secret they both chose not to speak aloud. And yet, it lived in every glance, every pause, every breath they shared that first day. He introduced her to the team with effortless grace, but there was a softness in his voice only she noticed. No one else knew what had happened. No one else had heard her trembling promise through the phone, and that made their connection sacred, quiet, and untouched by office gossip. A touching story hidden behind company lanyards and professional greetings. Days passed, then weeks. They worked together, mentor and mentee, but something deeper began to thread between the hours. She didn't flirt. He didn't overstep. But still, there was this pull, subtle and warm, like something gentle waking up between them, something that neither of them dared name, yet neither could ignore. Rachel didn't forget where she came from. She still called her mom every evening, still kept that fire inside burning. But now, there was room for something more. A future that didn't just include survival, but perhaps happiness. And sometimes, that's all we need, someone to believe in us before we believe in ourselves. Someone to light the path not with rescue, but with respect. And Donovan, he found himself changed, not by her resume, but by her resilience. Not by what she said in the boardroom, but by what she whispered in a cafe without knowing he was there. He didn't expect to feel something. But maybe, just maybe, love begins not with grand gestures, but with a coffee stain and a promise overheard. Do you think fate works in mysterious ways? Or do we create our own destiny through the choices we make in our hardest moments? Have you ever met someone in the most unexpected way and felt like it wasn't random at all? Could one small mistake really change the course of your life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your own emotional story or tell us. Have you ever spilled coffee on someone and wished it turned out like this? If this touching story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notifications so you don't miss the next real story. Because sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the beginnings of something extraordinary.